Hello and welcome to this Euractiv event. My name is Natasha Foote. I am an agri-food and health reporter here with Euractiv, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion on the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP as it is more commonly known, and more specifically how EU member states will deliver on their CAP strategic plans. So some quick background for you before we get stuck in. So the reform of the EU's farming subsidy programme, which will start in 2023 and run until 2027, is very nearly signed and sealed but not yet delivered. So through this reform, the Commission aims for a more flexible, performance and results-based approach to the CAP, which takes into account local conditions and needs. And the national CAP strategic plans are a central part of how the Commission aims to achieve this. So the basic premise of these plans is that each member state comes up with their own individualised plan of action on sustainability measures in their agri-food sector, which is then approved by the Commission. And this forms the basis of how the next CAP reform will be rolled out in their country over the coming years. These CAP strategic plans are also a key engine for delivering on the Commission's flagship food policy, the Farm to Fork strategy, which is not currently legally binding. So where are we at right now? Well, each member state is currently going through the process of writing these CAP strategic plans as we speak, and they are due for submission by the end of the year. And I also would like to point out this is the first time that member states will be doing a plan like this. And if that sounds a bit complicated, well, that's because it is. There are plenty of open-ended questions here. How far will member states go in integrating sustainability aims? How will the Commission enforce this, if at all? Will these strategic plans live up to their promises and pave the way for sustainable agriculture, forestry and rural development in the EU and beyond? So that is what we are here to discuss today. But before we get stuck into the debate, let me just go over a few housekeeping points with you. I'm sure you're all very familiar with these by now, but just in case. So this is an interactive event, meaning that we welcome all of your questions, which I'll be monitoring as we go along. So you can submit these questions via the chat function, and you can find this at the bottom of your screen. So when submitting a question, please do identify yourself, don't be shy. Keep your questions short and concise, and also indicate which of the panelists you'd like the question to go to. Do also feel free to add comments and questions as we go along. I'll be monitoring it the whole time. And we also encourage tweeting, so do join the online discussion on Twitter using the hashtag EADebates. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers today. And with us today, we have a range of panelists that bring a wealth of expertise. So I'm really excited to have what I'm sure will be a very rich discussion. So with us today, we have Tassos Haniotis, who's the Deputy Director General at the European Commission's DG Agri. We have Green MEP Thomas Weitz. Celia Neesens, who is a Policy Officer for Agriculture at the European Environmental Bureau. Udo Hemmerling, who is Chair of the Working Party on Direct Payments at EU's Farmers Association, COPA-COGECA. And last but certainly not least, we have Alan Matthews, who is a Professor of European Agricultural Policy at the Department of Economics at Trinity College Dublin. And also like to point out, if you are a fellow CAP nerd like I am, you might also know him from his excellent blog on the CAP reform, which is an absolute treasure trove of information. I highly recommend you check that out. You're welcome for the plug there, Alan. So a warm welcome to all of you. And I will now turn to each of you in turn for a short opening remark before we get stuck into the debate. So Tassos, let me come to you first for your opening remark.
Thank you very much, and a nice afternoon to everybody. You asked the question, how will the member states deliver in the CAP strategic plans? There are three things that we have to address here. Is first, what we know that they will do, what we hope that they will do, and what we expect that they will do. In the what we know that they're going to do, the information is as of yet incomplete, although clearly we have been having very informal and continuous contacts with member states in helping them to prepare their strategic plans. So I have to admit also that the information is not the same in all member states. Some of them are more advanced than others. All of them, however, are working towards submitting these plans. What we hope to get out of these plans, we're clearly a much higher level of ambition in all the specific objectives that the CAP is aimed to achieve. And if we have a higher level of ambition in these CAP specific objectives, we do have a pretty high level of ambition to to targets that relate to the farm to fork strategy. And what we expect out of these strategic plans. The first thing we expect respect to the recommendation process and the recommendations made to the member states. And this stressing the fact that it's in the recommendations as such, and in the SWOT analysis, the analysis on the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that we saw member states facing, we didn't really have a lot of disputes. Most of these recommendations and the analysis behind it is very common between us and the member states. And that's why, based on these recommendations, we do expect that these strategic plans will reflect a very high level of ambition that is required to be able to meet all the type of commitments we have taken over the years, from the Paris Agreement to the commitments that are stemming also from the successive proposals that the Commission had made, and also from the CAP reform itself, because the CAP reform, the underlying feature of the CAP reform is the need to strengthen the environmental ambition of the Common Agricultural Policy. And finally, when we assess these strategic plans, what we expect to see is a strategic approach that would look into the long-term delivery of these objectives, but also will look in a manner that is really integrated when it has to look at the environmental, the economic, and the social dimension of the strategic plans. We should not forget that in addressing higher environmental ambition, there are ways and best practices in place that would allow us, we hope and we expect, to do it in a manner that does not harm economic and social gains and efficiency, but clearly move things forward. And let me repeat what I said in the recent Farm to Fork strategy. I think this is, the recent Farm to Fork conference, I think this is achievable. It's clearly not going to be straightforward and uniform across all member states, but also clearly it is something that is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tassos, touching upon many issues we're going to dig into a lot deeper during the debate. So Thomas, now let me turn to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Natasha. First of all, where did we come from? We had a relatively ambitious proposal from the Commission that was already weakened a bit in the parliamentarian debate, going back to trilogue. They're being weakened again by several member states. And now we're seeing the question, or we're facing the question, how are member states going to implement the goals, which are now considered to be part of the CAP? How are they going to deliver in practice? And in fact, what I know up to now from the plans, we can see very much the influence that COPA is having on several member states, because the announcement of COPA earlier was, we need you, so the European Union, to pay farmers for what they're doing anyway. And this is actually, I would say, something that we see in most of the CAP strategic plans now materializing. So I see the ambitions as relatively low. I mean, if you still recall what the Court of Auditors found out, his findings about the last CAP and the last deliveries and national plans, was that the greening, that as we had it, was not delivering on the expectations of the European Union and not delivering on the expectations what these funds were originally meant for. So just going on with the stuff that we did up to now will not solve the problem, neither the biodiversity problem, nor the desertification, the erosion, the dead zones that we're creating in the sea, the high pressure on biodiversity, the lack of CO2 sequestration, which we would have an enormous potential for in agriculture. So it doesn't look all too good. And just to give you 2 or 3 examples of low ambition, as much as I know now, I mean, the CAP strategic plans have not been submitted to the Commission yet, but I have some insights as well into the German as also in the Austrian drafting. And what I see there is, well, sometimes nice headlines, like a headline saying, well, we need to engage into wetland preservation. Sounds great. But if you look at the details of this draft, it says, well, let's reduce the deepness of plowing up to 30 centimeters. Well, you know, plowing for 30 centimeters in a wetland that has stored a lot of CO2, a lot of carbon, will lead to re-emission of carbon, and it will simply not serve the purpose. So you see a nice headline, but then under that, just minor improvements which are not going to meet the goal if it stays like that. But luckily, that debate in Germany is not over yet. Or I give you a second example. When it comes to carbon farming, it sounds great. I'm a big fan of using agriculture and forestry to sequester CO2 into the soil. But then if you look into the details, are we really talking about long-lasting sequestration? Are we talking about humus, clay complexes, which are able to store the carbon for a long time? Or are we talking about short-term carbon sequestration, which is then re-emitted in the next year because of deep plowing again? So the devil lies in the details. Or just the last example, what I see in Austria happening. Even with the Green participation in the government, but our conservative agriculture minister tried to move the separate funding for organic farming, which was heavily contributing to Austria growing its organic sector towards 25%. So moving this from the second pillar into the first pillar and just making it one of many eco schemes, like kind of a top up for agricultural sector in the organic spectrum. And why so? Just to free, on the other side, in the second pillar, investment money. And there it's getting interesting, because what kind of investment are we talking about? Are we talking about investment on pork stables getting even bigger and bigger and bigger, and pushing out smaller farmers off the market, putting even more pressure on the prices that farmers get for their products? Or are we talking about the needed investments into the transition towards agroecological methods, also in conventional farming? So maybe investments into machinery for technical weeding instead of using herbicides and so on. And there again, you see a lack of definition, you see a lack of ring fencing for the investments for the right purpose. So we have to watch out that we do not see actually measurements in one pillar, in the other pillar, that are contradicting each other, and that are basically just designed to strengthen the ability of the sector to absorb as much money as possible without really meeting the environmental goals, and by the way, also not the rural development goals, because if we don't stop the closing down of hundreds of farms every single day in Europe, we will end up with a totally industrialized agriculture, and that's going to be it.
So lots of nice words and not enough action, to summarise there from you. Thomas, you touched upon a lot of technical details. I'm hoping we're going to get stuck into those a bit more during the debate. And you also mentioned COPA, so maybe it's natural to turn to Udo. I'm sure you've got something to say here. Maybe I can come to you next for your opening statement, please.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. I will just raise for the start 3 core points. First point, the coming CAP reform will really mean a major shift in agricultural support towards agri-environmental measures. I just give the example for Germany. We now today have about 900 million euros per year for agri-environmental measures, and altogether, with the coming eco schemes and the expansion of the second pillar budget, we will see 2.4 billion euros for agri-environmental measures in 2025-26. So this is really a major shift, and please do not underestimate this. This means really a major shift for the farmers. And at the initial point, this means also some income loss for farmers, because, the basic payment will go down. For example, in Germany, about 100 euros per hectare. So the money will shift to new challenges. Second point, we have a very tight time frame ahead of us. As farmers, we say we need clearance until next summer, because next summer the farmers do their planting plans for 2023. On the other hand, we need also time to assess, to discuss the proposed measures, the new eco schemes, for example, if they are realistic, if the farmer will really take them up, and things like that. And the final point I just want to make, we are a bit skeptic, and I'm personally quite skeptic, that the CAP strategic plan process will be kind of overloaded with the farm to fork strategy. Basically, the trialogue parties have made a basic decision. Farm to fork strategy is not a legal part of CAP strategic plans, but as far as possible, things have to be included. For this point, for example, we have very different, well, also national situation. I'll give you also my example from Germany. When it comes to animal welfare, we will have national plans for animal welfare. When it comes to climate protection, we have a national funding from emission trading budget, also for forestry and agriculture. And you have to see the whole picture, and it would be a short thing to say, where's climate protection in the CAP strategic plans in Germany? Where is animal welfare? Well, it's in our national budget, in our national measures. You have to see the whole picture, which is a bit beyond the CAP strategic plans. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much. So Thomas saying maybe there's not enough ambition, you saying maybe there's too much. I think I can see some interesting discussions coming here. Celia, let me turn to you now for your opening statement.
Thank you, Natasha. Probably everyone can guess which side I'm going to go towards. On our side, we see very clearly that there is not enough ambition. And we're not saying this just because we're, grumpy NGOs. We're saying this because we have done an extensive analysis over the last month or so of the plans in consultation with our members, also in collaboration with other NGO networks. We are gathering intelligence on what is being done at national level. And what we are seeing is a complete mismatch between what's being decided in the plans and the scale of the challenges that are facing the agriculture sector. And we're not even just talking of the environmental challenges, which are real, as we saw this summer with heat waves and droughts and floods happening all at the same time across Europe, but also these socioeconomic challenges and the need to distribute payments more fairly, etc. The plans are being developed by member states. From the information that we are getting, are continuing, by and large, a business as usual scenario, which flies completely in the face of the Green Deal, but of course, and not only of that, also of political commitments that have been made by every single government, national government, when it comes to biodiversity, when it comes to climate change, the Sustainable Development Goals, etc. And also it flies in the face of legally binding obligations that already exist in EU environmental laws. So it's very well to say that we can't overload CAP strategic plans with new obligations coming from the Green Deal, but even with existing obligations, we are not quite up to the task. And what we observe in particular is that even though this whole reform really relies on the new model whereby member states identify needs and then tailor their interventions through a strategic planning process, this is not what's happening. What's happening at national level is not strategic planning. There is an identification of needs, and there is a sort of identification and design of interventions, and there is a decision on the budget allocations, and those different processes do not follow a logic model in all places. In some places, they're completely separate, with a political decision coming in the middle of the process and ignoring the technical work to then decide we put money there. That's the political decision, that is it. In the very worst cases, we're seeing, for example, in Hungary, in Greece, in Cyprus, in Romania, these are really the bad students at the back of the class where NGOs don't have any information at all. It seems The strategic planning process is not even happening. There is no information on what's going to be in eco schemes, about what's going to be done in conditionality. Nothing. Huge delays. We have a month and a half, 2 months before the deadline, and there is no information. Most countries are doing a bit better, but we are still seeing that they are respecting the letter of the strategic planning idea, but not the spirit, as I was just saying. Even though the challenges that are identified are significant, the ambition of the interventions is generally low. There are gaps, lots of issues are not addressed. And so this major shift that we just heard about from Udo, we're not seeing it happening. Most of the environmental money is being used to pay for, in many cases, what farmers are already doing. So the budget is being spread very thinly on what's already being done, and then the farmers who are the most ambitious end up with very little money to reward their efforts. So it's quite worrying, and we really, at this stage, we have still some time to try and steer the ship in the right direction. So our call is really strongly to the Commission to raise the bar, both in the technical work and political level, to ensure that member states are really meeting their obligations, not just looking at the Green Deals, but also the obligations that already exist. And the first step for that we've been calling on the Commission to do is to be transparent, to publish the draft plans that will be submitted at the end of the year, for example, so that citizens can know what is being done with their taxpayers' money and how this money is being spent in the agriculture sector.
Thank you, Celia, highlighting, yes, indeed, the deadline is looming, and we will talk a little bit about that later on. Lastly, but not least, let me come to you, Alan, for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and good afternoon to everybody. I think we all know what we would like to see in terms of implementation. We would like to see the use of strategic planning. So based on the needs assessment and the SWOT analysis, a prioritization of objectives, the design of interventions, setting of targets and milestones, and of course, doing all of this within a participatory framework, including all stakeholders and not least the state authorities involved with environmental protection. We would like to see a high level of environmental and climate ambition, and we would like to see the interventions designed in terms of giving value for money to the European taxpayer. And I guess, of course, we have to wait until we see what the draft plans look like at the end of the year. But it is, I think, likely in at least some cases that the reality will be somewhat different. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. And the first is indeed the timing issue. National administrations, even where there is a desire to fulfill the spirit of the CAP reform, are under huge time pressure. I'm not aware of whether any member state has actually published its draft strategic plan this month, October, but certainly all of those have to go through a strategic environmental assessment by law, an appropriate assessment. This will take a month. It has these assessments have to go for public consultation. There has to be some time for the national administrations to take any recommendations into account. And all of this has to be done by the end of the year, which is obviously putting pressure on some of the desirable features in terms of broad consultation and actually giving administrations time to really design effective schemes. So it does raise the question whether we can meet the end of year deadline, whether the Commission needs to show additional flexibility. And of course, that then comes up against the point that Udo was making, that farmers do also need certainty at an early point in time. There are, of course, these political economy pressures. So maybe it is a little bit naive and perhaps idealistic to think of strategic planning in this sort of technocratic way of setting objectives, designing instruments, and so on. It's clearly a highly political process. And this is because, of course, the distribution of resources is at stake. So when it comes to, for example, whether we have capping or not, this is often decided on the basis of, the balance of interests in a particular member state. And the same with eco schemes. It's not necessarily whether they are going to be effective in achieving those objectives. It's ensuring that all types and farming systems are able to benefit because one group doesn't want to see all the money going in the other group's direction. So those political economy issues are clearly coming to the fore. The reporting arrangements have become extremely complicated. So there is a huge administrative challenge, and we can come back to discussing, whether the indicators are appropriate, and indeed whether we don't have some overload in terms of what we're asking administrations to do. And then finally, in terms of the eco schemes, which of course are one of the main novelties of this CAP reform. And here administrations, they have a trinity of objectives that they must fulfill. So they have a budget ceiling that they must meet on an annual basis. They have an enrollment or uptake target. So they need to get sufficient farmers into the scheme. And finally, they have a projected unit value, how much the individual farmer is going to get per hectare for the practices that are required. And those three objectives have got to balance. And that's extremely difficult when you're trying to set targets and plans, up to 6 years in advance. And it's clear that member states are playing it cautious here, and that they are going for the option that is likely to lead to the greatest enrollment. So we are shallow schemes, and we may see, if you like, the maintenance of particular ecosystem services, but whether we will see much change in management as a result of eco schemes remains open to question. So those would be the points that I would feel are important at this stage in the debate, Natasha. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for all of your opening statements. So let's get stuck in to the debate today. Tassos, I'm going to turn to you first to set the scene a little bit for our discussion. So I've obviously briefly touched upon different stages that have led up to the drafting of these CAP strategic plans. I know you and Alan both mentioned the SWOT analysis. Perhaps you go into a little bit more detail about the support that's been on offer from the Commission for this, considering it's the first time that member states are doing this. How has the Commission been active in shaping the future of these plans?
Well, thanks for the question. The Commission has been active in shaping these plans from the beginning that we made this proposal. We always had dialogue with the member states, and we have started the dialogue in designing, helping the member states to put up the strategic plans even before the Farm to Fork strategy was put in place. So there is a series of meetings at the technical level in which we explain to member states what is the logic of the specific objectives we have, what are the underlying analytical foundations that made us think that we have to increase the level of ambition everywhere. And in the process of this, since it's been months now, we spent the most of this year working bilaterally with member states, explaining to them what they have to do, receiving questions for them, what one or the other item implies, but very specifically focusing on the needs approach. And we have gone step by step. First, the SWOT analysis, then the needs approach, the link of this to indicators. So there are toolkits that will explain to member states what exactly they're going to do. But I think it's best if I give a concrete example of how to go about it, because perfect is always the worst enemy of the good. And it's obvious that if we sit in our offices, we can all design perfect policies and strategies. But in the real world, we have to see what is available. First thing, the baseline is known. So we know how to answer the first question that some of the speakers already answered, that they know that the level of ambition is not going to be higher and people will keep doing what they're doing. Well, I'm sorry, but how do we know that? We know the baseline, and we haven't even seen what will be coming from the member states. Let me take one issue as soil, which is very interesting because we don't have a soil directive, and we can keep talking about legally binding obligations, but we don't even have a soil directive. And yet we have a policy whose leverage is exactly in terms of practices that help improving what is happening in the soil. We have put an indicator that measures improvements in the soil. We have a target that actually addresses this, a target that before it was set up at the EU level as part of the Farm to Fork strategy was part of all the discussions we had in the preparation of the CAP reform. Do we really need to wait for the Green Deal targets to realize that when it comes to soil management, we have to improve all the practices applied in 100% of land in the European Union? I thought we had solved that already years ago. And what we also need to look is, when we're going to look at the strategic plans of the member states, we will have to see what are the practices that they want to promote, how these practices meet the specific problems that we and the member states have identified. There are hotspots where we have to do much more than other areas. The Joint Research Center has done a whole literature review, which is available to member states, that demonstrates what practices work, under which conditions, where the situation is more mixed. And then we have to look on two things. The first is where the money goes. And I think we need to remind people that it wasn't us that proposed ring fencing, because we wanted to leave more flexibility. Ring fencing is a reality. So ring fencing is a reality. Member states have to implement specific measures. But then they have to show that these particular measures are able to move their level of ambition higher. This is what exactly we're going to assess. And a final point here, I don't know if farmers are already doing what they're doing. As long as the environment is changing, and it's changing in a less favorable way for farmers because of the climate challenges, if they keep doing what they're doing, this already would indicate that they have a certain degree of resilience. But on the ground, farmers, not all, but most farmers, are not simply doing what they used to do, but they're trying to clearly adjust to the new situation. And a lot of the capacity of farmers to be able to adjust to this situation will be linked to the type of measures that member states are going to take, and we will look at them on what type of advice they're ready to provide to member states. Because without functioning farm advisory systems, all the discussion that we're having here is purely theoretical.
And talking about adjusting to new situations, let's talk about the green architecture in these CAP plans. So we have these eco schemes. I think Alan said this, called them the main novelties of this CAP reform. So these are the environmental actions designed to reward farmers for certain agricultural practices that are considered useful for delivering environmental goals. Udo, these eco schemes represent a major shift. Well, some would say they represent a major shift in the way that the CAP works. Could you outline how you see this impacting the sector?
Yeah, okay. I will really agree to what Alan said, that the planning process of the eco schemes lead quite to a defensive offer of eco schemes to the farmers. What do I mean? We have now the draft in Germany for eco schemes, and there we see that the payment for the agro-environmental measures are 30% or sometimes 50% lower than what we are used to know in the second pillar payments for comparable measures. So this is really a core point, that eco schemes are calculated quite low, and so it's not attractive for so many farmers. Second point, just to think Celia mentioned, is the question carbon storage measures in agro-environmental measures or eco schemes. We made also a proposal for rewarding farmers for keeping grassland and keeping higher grade of carbon, for not plowing and so on. And our government said, no, the farmers do this either way, so we are not rewarding them extra. But this is completely opposite to what we call about carbon, what we talk about carbon farming strategy, we need to reward farmers for their climate-friendly practices, and not just saying, "Oh, they are doing it already, so we don't reward them." That's a bit too short. Thank you.
And in terms of the options available for eco schemes, I like to think of these options available to member states like a bit of a menu, where member states can choose their own combination of eco schemes, kind of a la carte situation. Of course, the different dishes that they choose off the menu will have a huge impact. And I know, Alan, you already mentioned the impact, the fact that maybe there's not a clear long-term view on this, maybe the uptake of the eco schemes are uncertain. In your opinion, Alan, how will that shape member states' decisions on eco schemes they're taking right now?
Well, I think it member states. Udo says that in Germany they have been in a defensive position. I would perhaps say it's leading to a lot of caution in terms of the approach to eco schemes. So member states might like to be more ambitious, but they are aware that if they don't get the enrollment that they need, they could well end up not using all of their minimum budget, and some of that would have to go back to Brussels, because with the Pillar 1 payment, you cannot keep it from one year to the next. And therefore, they are playing safe. And I think we do see, or we will see, and of course Tassos is right, we haven't yet seen the draft plans, but we will see, I think, a lot of situations where indeed farmers are being paid for practices that by and large they are doing anyway. Now, in some cases, this may be justified. But we do need also to incentivize the transition towards more sustainable farming systems. We do need to see changes in farm management on the ground. And it's still an open question as to whether this will indeed be the case. I mean, one of the things, I suppose, about eco schemes, I'm not entirely convinced that, at least from an agri-environment point of view, that annual schemes are really the most appropriate approach. It seems to me agri-environment initiatives, are a somewhat longer-term commitment on the part of farmers. But one of the advantages is, of course, that member states can revise these schemes on an annual basis, unlike the Pillar 2 schemes, where a farmer enters a contract in year one, and that is set then for the 5 or 7 year period of the scheme. So there is perhaps the potential when we see what individual member states are doing, that we can learn from each other, and that successful schemes may be transferred over time. Now that's an optimistic view, I agree, and it will require a lot of pushing, to achieve that outcome. But it is a potential advantage of eco schemes that we could see a ratcheting up of ambition over time.
Yeah, it's definitely true. It's interesting, you mentioned this, you can revise over time, learn and move and revise, which could be seen as a positive thing. Thomas, I know you're on the edge of your seat wanting to come in with a comment on this. So let me hear your reaction to what we've heard so far, but also let me add a question for you. There's been quite a lot of criticism about the different eco schemes that are on the menu for member states to choose from. In your opinion, are these too broad, not broad enough? What is your take on this menu on offer?
Well, first of all, to answer Tassos, how do we know? Well, I'm involved into drafting of the CAP strategic plan in Austria, where I have information from Germany, Belgium government, Irish government. So we know quite something about the process that is going on. And then to be very concrete, what are we talking about? An eco scheme to have crop rotation. It was proposed by the Commission, it was proposed by the Parliament, it was downplayed by the Council. Crop rotation is a very easy measurement to reduce your pesticides, to increase positive impact on biodiversity, and to have a positive impact on your soil. There's no question, it's not a question of organic or non-organic. That meets the requirements in every form of agriculture. And is it still there? No, it's not. No crop rotation as a condition for eco schemes. Second example, a real shift from artificial artificial fertilizers to green fertilizers. Artificial fertilizer means 1 to 2 kilo of gas to produce 1 kilo of artificial fertilizer, plus emissions of NOx then at the field. And so climate-related gases. So shifting to green fertilizers would mean having plants collecting CO2 via photosynthesis, which we're then digging into the ground, and through this increasing the fertility of the soil. Is it in the CAP strategic plan? Is it proposed as one of the eco schemes? Not on a big scale, just as one small added measurement, not on a big scale to do that shift. Or a land-based animal husbandry, that we're actually only subsidizing animal fattening and animal production when it's related on the land a farmer actually has to feed its animals. Maybe not 100%, but 70 or 80%. Do we have that land-based animal husbandry? No, it has been negotiated out of eco schemes, while animal husbandry and fattening is one of the main emitters of climate gases, methane, and so on. And then capping, last but not least, when we talk about rural areas, where we also see, I mean, the more diversity you have in agriculture, the more spaces between the fields, between the crops, between the land you have, and the better it is for biodiversity. So regions that have small and medium farming still, like Slovenia or Austria or parts of Romania, they don't have that biodiversity problems like other agricultural regions that went industrial. And do we see a real capping, so a real support for the small and medium-sized farmers? No, again, not. Unfortunately, Copa Cogeca didn't really negotiate for that. They negotiated for the 5% big farmers, but not for the 95% small farmers. But where I am with Copa is that we need to ensure that farmers get a fair price for their product and they get pay for their extra work they need to do to become more environmental. There, I'm fully on their side. And we need importation standards or tolls or whatever to protect our production, because if we demand high standards from producers and we do not demand the same high standards on imported goods, we're going to ruin partly our agricultural production. And there I'm on the same side as Copa.
And Celia, I know you're also looking to come in on this topic of eco schemes. I mean, to add a question here, the items on the menu, you know, there's a lot of discussion. We hear a lot of really nice words, agroforestry, agroecology. It's been pointed out by a number of civil society organisations that they don't actually appear maybe as much as they would like them to in the recommendations. I mean, what is your take on this, and how can member states be expected to include these kind of eco schemes if they are not recommended to do so?
Okay, I'll try to keep that question on the back of my mind to just comment on the discussion that was just happening right now. So just because my name was mentioned earlier on the topic of carbon farming and what we need to pay farmers for, from our side, there's a very important distinction that needs to be made between the maintenance of basic practices that farmers may already be doing, like putting cover crops in winter or having a buffer strips along a watercourse. This belongs in conditionality. Crop rotation as well, that Thomas was just mentioning. These elements are more or less included in the EU framework for conditionality, but the way in which they will be implemented at national level is in the hands of member states. And what we're seeing is that generally the ambition is very low. When we have information, because actually it's quite striking that a lot of member states are already planning their voluntary measures without having decided on how they will implement conditionality, which is supposed to be the baseline. So we don't even know where the floor stands when we already start to plan what we will be paying for on top of that floor. And these basic practices should not be paid for. This is the baseline, but we do need to provide money for farmers who are doing really beneficial systems like agroforestry, high nature value farming, etc. We need to help them maintain those valuable systems in place. But when it comes to carbon farming, for example, we can't just pay for what already exists. We need to incentivize farmers to go beyond. And that's a point that Ellen already made, so I won't say more on that. On your question of how do we have more ambition, I'm guessing you were referring to the Commission recommendations here, and you mentioned recommendations.
Yes, I was, yeah.
Okay, that's what our members are trying to do day in, day out. They are making recommendations to their national governments, but it's very difficult. In some cases, they are not even being listened to They are not getting meetings. They are not invited to comment on documents. They are not getting information about what their government is thinking about. So it's incredibly difficult to have a constructive exchange and to provide, recommendations based on their expertise when the door is closed. When the door is somewhat open, they are trying to encourage more action and, trying to not just look at eco schemes, which are just one measure. It's really important, of course, also to look at the use of investment support, the use of agri-environment climate measures, etc. And we count on the Commission to also, where those elements were included in the recommendations, make sure that member states are really acting on that. And we have heard positive commitment, but the proof will be in the pudding, I think is the phrase. So we are waiting to see how the Commission will react to those plans when they are tabled, really.
A good phrase, I like that one. Tassos, I see your hand. I was going to come straight to you. Celia mentioned making sure member states are acting on this. These plans have been earmarked as the main engine for delivering on the goals of the Green Deal, which is not, legally binding. The question on everyone's lips, of course, is, how can the Commission enforce this kind of linkage?
Thanks. I was raising my hand because I cannot type on the internal chat. I wanted to comment, and I will start with what Celia said, because she raised two extremely important issues. The first one is conditionality, which nobody had mentioned, including me before. When we talk about the baseline, and we talk about the need to increase the level of ambition, if we don't increase the level of ambition on conditionality, I think we can forget about the rest. And that's why it is extremely important in this discussion to identify factually what are the problems that member states have to address. Because this is what will tell us whether particular measures really go in the direction of increasing the level of ambition or not. And here, it is important to note that, some practices that appear benign are pretty important. Keeping, for example, permanent grassland might seem to be relatively easy. But if you don't have an economically viable farm there, and you turn this into arable land, then the cost to the environment is going to be pretty significant. In other areas, we need to focus on other type of challenge that we have. So the first thing that is very important is the conditionality. The second that is also very important is the issue of transparency. And we have put pressure on member states, and we keep repeating on them that this process, to be credible, has to have a wider participation of all the stakeholders in the preparation of the strategic plans. Because if the member states avoid to do that, they will face it, of course, in the next stage of the discussion, where people will validly raise questions about whether their opinion has been taken into account or not. And what is very important to keep in mind right now is that when it comes to transparency, the type of challenges that we face are evident and known to everybody. That's why I stressed before that when it came to the SWOT analysis and the needs-based analysis, at least there, nobody could hide. So we have a starting point that is important. Finally, on the legally binding issue, and I saw also on the Twitter, I'm not supposed to follow it, but I have to follow it as you invited everybody to be active there. Yeah, there was even the question about the commissioner said and whether it's a contradiction. Now, let me very clear, let me remind people a couple of things. When we're preparing the Common Agricultural Policy, and one that Thomas said was more ambition than what came out between Council and Parliament, when we made this preparation, we started with 4 workshops as part of the impact assessment. The first one was on new societal needs and a focus on the use of antibiotics in animal feed and its link not only with human health, but also with animal health and animal welfare. The second was focusing on voluntary versus mandatory agro-environmental measures and what we need to do to increase the overall level of ambition. The third was on the climatic risks and what type of risk management we should have to address them. And the fourth was on the poverty reduction and the social dimension of the Common Agricultural Policy. Every single target that is part of the farm to fork strategy, every single one was already part of the proposal we made for the future Common Agricultural Policy. we didn't have an EU-wide target, but we had very clearly the requirement for member states to set targets at the national level that clearly express a higher level of ambition and the link of these measures in achieving the overall orientation of the future CAP. So for me, this debate on whether it's legally or not legally binding, I don't see where it leads. One could easily say cynically, so what? Do we have to address environmental problems? Do we have to respond to climate change? Well, if we have to do, obviously, we have, first of all, to make sure that when it comes to soil organic matter, things get much better than what they are. In fact, on soil, on air, on water, and biodiversity, clearly we have to arrive at a situation that is much better tomorrow than what it is today. So, I mean, let's work on that instead of having a ping pong about procedural issues. That's my personal feeling on that. And I don't see why we waste so much energy in this debate instead of focusing on what some of you put a criticism, how we're going to assess the level of ambition. I'm telling you, we will assess the level of ambition on something that is measurable on the ground, in the soil, in air, in water, and in biodiversity. And also without hurting the income or farmers or the social dimension.
Yeah, thank you for that. We'll definitely come back to the monitoring point, the monitoring issue you raised there. I just have one follow-up question for you, just a short one. Euractiv reported back in July that the EU's Agricultural Commissioner, Janusz Wojciechowski, said he doesn't see a situation where a member state's national plan would be rejected by the Commission for failing to align with the Green Deal. He was saying, instead, he was banking on the power of persuasion to make to encourage member states to do this. I suppose my question is, in your opinion, would the Commission reject a plan for not adequately aligning with the Green Deal, and should it?
Well, that's the advantage that politicians, they have more persuasive power than bureaucrats at us. What we have to do is make sure that when we make the assessment of the plans of the member states, we are transparent, we're accurate in the facts that come to them, and the college will take the decision on the basis of the information we have. So I cannot prejudge not only the decision of the college, but I cannot prejudge what we haven't received yet.
Thank you for that. And the discussion so far is centered on how to put more of the farm to fork strategy into these CAP strategic plans. Udo, in your opening remarks, you were talking about the issue of overloading farmers and ensuring, balancing the ambition with not overloading farmers. So I'm looking to you now for the farmers' perspective, on this concern of overloading, like how complicated this CAP strategic plan process is for farmers.
Basically, it's two different questions: overloading the farmers and overloading the admission process of the CAP strategic plans. That are different points for certain view. When it comes to farmers, well, we have then a clear list for the eco scheme measures. We have a clear list for second pillar measures. The farmers can choose. We have the conditionality, which is really still a long catalog, which will be a catalog of 100 pages of paper farmers have to follow. But the question of the agro-environmental measures are mainly, are they attractive for the farmers? Also to earn a bit of money from doing more for the environment. And the other thing is the political process. And I can just repeat it. I'm a bit skeptic that the farm to fork strategy challenges can overload the process of the next 8 or 10 months what we have. So the farmers need clearance until next summer. And so we need a kind of clear and swift assessment process of the CAP strategic plans, like Tasso said. Thank you.
And turning now to this issue of timeline. Now, we've heard from all of the panelists of this pressure of the looming deadline of the end of the year. So a number of member states have expressed they're struggling with this tight timeline. I know we actually recently reported as many as a third of member states are struggling, and some have even said they might miss the deadline entirely. So, Alan, in your opinion, what impact could this have on the implementation of the CAP reform, this kind of delay?
Well, of course, we don't know whether there will be a delay. Obviously, if a member state cannot, at the moment, they must get their plans in by the end of this year. It's up to the Commission, I suppose, to see what flexibility the regulation gives them in terms of whether member states can submit some of their documents at a later stage, or whether everything must be submitted on day one. The issue that I see is that, you know, in the rush at the end, and these plans are going to determine how money is spent over a 5-year period until 2027. So, you know, if it makes sense to allow another couple of weeks into January in order to perhaps get a somewhat more thoughtful plan in place, that seems to me perhaps worth allowing for. And if the regulation doesn't allow, there might be the opportunity in November, when the Parliament comes to vote on the regulation, to make some minor change, to give a little bit of extra time, if indeed it proves in mid-November that, you know, more than just 1 or 2 member states are going to face difficulties.
And obviously we see a number of different member states struggling with different things, everyone being on different levels. Celia, you mentioned that, you know, your members were looking at individual member states. I mean, what's your feeling about what isn't going well in different member states on the ground? Do you have some specific examples to offer us?
Yeah, so in addition to some of the elements that I've already mentioned, so for example, one key concern is that still in many countries, there is just no information. In some countries, no information at all, but in some countries, no information, for example, on conditionality, and that's a big problem. But in addition to that, we're also starting to see information on what eco-schemes will be. We are seeing that quite often the amount of money that is put for a specific eco-scheme doesn't really match the level of ambition. So we have ambitious schemes with low funding that are not likely to be enough of an incentive. We have very unambitious schemes with a lot of money that are essentially just a top-up on income support, because they're not actually requiring farmers to do much. Just an example that I was looking at earlier was, for example, a scheme requiring farmer to use the FAST tool, so the farm sustainability tools for nutrients. And if they use that and also do liming, they would get paid, I think it was something like €160 per hectare in a Central Eastern country. So quite a lot of money for no guaranteed environmental benefit here. So it's a big mixed bag, and that is really quite concerning. Overall, we're also seeing that even if in some countries eco-schemes are reasonably good, there are big gaps. So individual measures might be good, but when you add it all up, it doesn't get you to where we need to be, or to where we need to get to, rather. We know that this decade is absolutely crucial for tackling biodiversity loss and climate change. This CAP will run up until 2027. So we really need to make progress. And when you add up the eco-schemes, measures in the second pillar, etc., our members are telling us it's not going to do the trick. And then on top of that, we're also hearing that several measures are still going to be in place that were in place previously that have had negative impacts on the environment. The worst case here is, for example, investment support for irrigation in southern countries, in Spain, in Portugal, in parts of France, where we are using water unsustainably. There have been evidence from case studies, in the evaluation study of the Commission on this, that this measure, investment support for irrigation, has had negative impacts. And our members are telling us it's not changing. This is going to continue. We're very worried. We're also seeing investment support being used for investments in livestock production, which could lead to an intensification of livestock in some parts of Europe. Thomas is agreeing with me. That's a really big issue. So not only is the environmental money not necessarily being spent as ambitiously as it needs to be and as effectively as it needs to be, but on top of that, we are also still using this taxpayers' money to fuel the problems. So it's really quite there's a lot of concerns here on what we're seeing on the ground.
Thank you very much for that. And of course, the tight time frame and missing deadlines, things like that, means one thing at the political level, but on the farmers level, who need to be making decisions for the future, Udo, I'm turning to you now. For the impact of this on farmers who have to be long-term planning.
Well, farmers do long-term and short-term planning at the same time. That's their job. Having a long-term plan for the farm and having a plan for the next plant season and harvesting season. And so, again, we as farmers, we need clear offers of the CAP strategic plans as for the measures already in next summer, so the farmers can plan, can make their plans for their for the winter seed in next autumn. And so this is our perspective now on the CAP strategic plans, and so we really hope that we get really a bit early information, maybe a bit earlier than we had last time with the start of the greening in 2015. Thank you.
Dealing with short-term and long-term planning, it feels like a moderation. It feels like what you do as a moderator. Constantly one eye here, one eye in the future. And let's talk now a little bit about transparency. It's a theme that's come up a few times now. Tassos, I'd like to hear from you on this. I know a number of sources and civil society vocal for calling for a transparent process throughout the drafting of the CAP strategic plans. Maybe you can offer some clarity here for us. Does the Commission plan to allow access to the drafts or partial drafts of the CAP plans exchanged between Member States and the Commission before the final versions are approved? I'm trying to understand what information will be publicly accessible throughout this process of developing these CAP strategic plans.
Well, first of all, I think we have to realize that in all the processes that we have, there are some things that will be made publicly available and some things that are not made publicly available. I mean, when you have informal discussions with Member States where you exchange totally informally certain elements to clarify things, if we go into the process where everything becomes available, the only thing is that we will overburden the process without really helping something. But it has to be clear, and the strategic plans have to be publicly available. The Member States are making it publicly available. I don't see any interest in the Member States of not making this publicly available. Now, in the process of the observation letters that the Commission is going to do, and the final assessment of the Member States, we will have to clearly, on the basis of the rules we have, see what will be made available and what will not be made available. But I would like to make and stress one thing in terms of the transparency. What is really missing in terms of the transparency is not the exchange of formal letters between us and the Member States or the stakeholders. What is missing in the debate we're having about transparency is to try to take a very close look on the type of information that is already publicly available, and we don't debate around it. I mean, do we really need to discuss what type of exchanges we have to realize that when it comes to soil conditions in Member States, we do have problems, and the problems are specific in certain areas, in certain practices, in certain regions, in certain Member States, more than in others? This is an information that is already available. I believe that what is missing in this process is to have a very concrete and factual debate about what works and what doesn't work, and under which conditions we can make all things work better than today. And this is where this proceduralism, I'm expressing here a personal feeling from what I see on that, is actually delaying the decision that we have. The same thing applies with all the discussion. Will the member states make their strategic plans available by the end of the year or not? Who's going to pay the price? I mean, on the 1st of January of 2023, member states will have to implement their strategic plans and will have to have the money to give to their own farmers in all the measures they have. So what's the point of getting stuck, and you used the term before in the debate, on issues like this and miss the big picture? And the big picture is we have to address very specific challenges. We have in the public domain the knowledge of what works, what doesn't work, and how. And instead of that, we are bogged down again on how much money will go here and by which date they're going to make an assumption. Well, I'm sorry that I didn't answer this question, but I consider it not to be, the pertinent one, because when it comes to transparency, we have rules, and on the basis of the rules, of course, the information that has to be made transparent will be made transparent. It's before that member states now will have to start inviting all the stakeholders in on the consultation processes they have. And that's beyond our control right now. It's their control, their responsibility right now.
And I've seen we do actually have a question in the chat about that, but I'll get to that in a minute. Talking about looming deadlines, I'm aware that ours is also, but Thomas, you'd like to come in on this issue of transparency. What is your take on this?
We're talking about 30%, more than 30% of the EU budget. We're talking about billions of euros of taxpayers' money. We're talking about a policy that is concerning their health, their direct surrounding in which they're living, beyond all the climate and biodiversity questions. So I think it's an obligation to be as transparent as possible, not just on the side of the Commission, but also very much on the side of the member states, also transparent on who is actually influencing that process, these negotiations, on what legal ground and on what purpose. And this transparency, I think, is not debatable. It's an obligation.
Thank you very much. And as I said, looming deadlines. So I could keep talking to you guys about this for much, much longer. But let me turn now to some of the questions we have in our chat. And there was one question. It's something that you mentioned, that you touched upon there, Tassos. There's a question here from the European Coordination Via Campesina from Genevieve Savigny. I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly. Sorry about that, Genevieve. This is to you, Tassos. She would like to know, in some countries, small farmers associations are not invited to the discussion on national strategic plans. She sees little opportunities to promote certain practices such as agroecology. She'd like to know what can be done about this.
Well, first of all, you all have to be sure that in all the informal bilateral discussions we have to member states, we stress this repeatedly. And our Director General, in 2 meetings that we had with his counterparts in member states, he made this point. We cannot force it, but it's something that we more than encourage. We keep stressing it. Second, this is one of the issues that will be interesting when we receive the strategic plans of the member states. And of course, we will have to see what specific measures have they taken for small farmers, and what are the measures for the distribution of support, which is one of the orientations of the Common Agricultural Policy. So that's why I stress once more, it's in the interest of member states themselves to invite all the stakeholders in, and it is our obligation to keep pushing to the extent that we can in this direction, and we do actually.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'll take one more question. There is a question here for you, Celia, from Niels Madsen. And Niels would like to know if you could expand a little bit and substantiate your claim that eco-schemes are being paid to farmers for doing something that they are already doing. Perhaps you could just comment on that very quickly before we move to the closing statements.
Yes, I must say we've received information on over 100 eco-schemes, so it's a bit hard to remember all of them. But this is something that especially has been very prominent in France as a big issue, which has been explicitly stated as an objective by the French agriculture minister. They want eco-schemes to be inclusive, which means allow farmers to access the money without having to do more. And we are seeing this trend as well in other countries. There are eco-schemes for, if not necessarily things are already being done, maybe minor changes that do not necessarily bring a large environmental benefit, and things that we believe should be in conditionality, like, for example, cover crops in winter, or having some fertilizer management plan. These are just sort of common sense farming, are they not? I think any good farmer out there would already be doing this, and we should use a balance of incentives with eco schemes and also rules to get everyone on a decent baseline, so that we can then raise the level of ambition and not just pay everyone for very ambitious practices. But we will be publishing more information soon. Sorry that this was not necessarily very concrete, but we are working on a report where we will give very concrete examples of what we're talking about here.
So watch this space. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. We now have 5 minutes left exactly. So that makes, by my count, exactly 1 minute for each of you for your closing remarks. So let me turn to you, Tassos, for your closing remark.
Well, let me, as a closing remark, try to be practical, starting from the last point mentioned by Celia. I think we have forgotten one thing in all the discussion, that what will be judged in the CAP reform is performance, and performance on the ground. So whether a certain eco scheme is actually ambitious or not will be tested on what it delivers. And if some of these eco schemes were as widely spread, and if they were as common sense as we thought, well, we have to find an answer why farmers don't use it all. And that's where I think we need to put the pressure. There are a lot of best practices out there that make common sense, that work, and farmers don't apply them. And that's where we need to put the pressure on. And the pressure should be in trying to convince in various ways that it is in the interest of everybody to introduce this type of measures and measure concretely the performance more than actually the list of measures themselves.
Thank you very much. And now moving to you, Thomas, for your closing statement.
Well, I think we should see the bigger picture. At the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, is our agricultural policy fit for global warming effects and for limiting global warming? Is it fit to stop biodiversity crisis? Is it fit to support family farms and medium-sized farms also in terms of rural development? And is it fit to actually provide our citizens with maximum healthy food? This is the main question I think we should ask ourselves. And in fact, having a situation where today agriculture is part of the problem, it's part of the destruction, and we know we could make it part of the solution on all of these questions. Moving 10% further towards the solution doesn't lead us out of the destructive field. So I think we can cherish a small little betterings in the current procedure, but I think it's just not going far enough, not to my taste, but to what science tells us in terms of climate, in terms of biodiversity, and what we just see in the rural areas that are many people are leaving and villages are dying. This is just what we see on the ground, and unfortunately all the proposals I've seen up to now are not fit for purpose.
Thank you very much for that concise statement. Celia, I'll turn to you now for your closing statement.
Thank you. I think Thomas has said everything I might have wanted to say on ambition, so I'd like to focus again on what Tassos seems to think is not that important, which is processes, governance, accountability, which are all relying on transparency. Transparency is not just a nice thing, it's crucial for citizens and civil society to be able to scrutinize the decisions that are made by their elected representatives. In this case, it's crucial because there's a lot of money in the picture, in the balance, and so we really need the Commission to live up to the commitments that have been made at the highest political level, not later than last week by the Commissioner again, and really have full transparency so that we can know what is going on, we can see where the money is being put, and we can use that to call out decision makers when they are saying one thing and doing a different thing, which is what is happening now. They are committing to tackle biodiversity and then putting money in unsustainable irrigation, in intensive livestock farming, in monocultures. This is not okay. We really need better transparency and full commitment from the Commission on this at all levels.
Thank you. Udo, let me turn to you now for your reflections on the discussion that we had today.
Yeah, thank you. First point again on transparency of the process. We made quite a good experience. I can tell you from my organization, from DBV in Germany, not to wait for the government, but to have the communication, especially to the environmental organizations, already in advance, to talk together in video roundtables, not wait for the government, but identifying the often different priorities, but identifying and talking about and learning. That's an important thing we can do as farmers organizations. Second point and last point is the question of success. We want to make this eco schemes and the whole green architecture a success, that it will be hopefully interesting programs for the farmers that support them for their ecologic tasks, but also for their economic tasks. You know, the incomes are not the highest of the farmers all over Europe. And so we try to bring it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Alan, let me hear from you for your reflections on what we've heard during this debate.
Well, it was a very interesting debate, and I sympathize somewhat with what Tasso said, that maybe what's important is the direction of travel and not so much whether issues are legally binding or not. But he also said that it's important to ensure that we have performance, that we actually see progress on the ground. And I think in order to do that, we do need metrics. And I think the issue around whether targets are legally binding or not is precisely the fear that member states will not commit to targets, impact targets in their plans. So I will be judging the plans on the basis of, what is the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that is aimed for by 2027? What is the reduction in pesticide use? What is the increase in organic area? What is the increase in land set aside for nature and habitats? Unless we see these kind of specific commitments in the strategic plans, then I think we really will not have succeeded in this particular reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings today's event to a close. I could have kept going for a lot longer. I want to thank all of our speakers today for this very dynamic discussion, and of course to all of you watching, all of you that tuned in for today's event. So just a reminder that you can find this event on Euractiv's YouTube channel in case you want to relive all the fun all over again. Also to look out for some articles we will publish on this theme very shortly. And also be sure to check out Euractiv's CAP Strategic Plans Tracker. So we're actually tracking the latest movement from all the member states and their state of play on their plans. That's all from me today. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Natasha Foote. I hope you have a lovely afternoon.